It looks like it's 8 o'clock here. I'll go ahead and get us started here. So I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today. Second day of the GIS Day conference. Everybody here bright and early. So all of us brave folks that made it in here first thing at 8 in the morning. Notice this year it looks a little different. No learning labs, no vendor areas, but all presentations here, our virtual presentations. Basically, and you guys have found us so far. So basically, yeah, as I said yesterday, we'll join the presentations individually by the links provided in email calendar invites you got, or you can visit the in.gov/GIS page to navigate those. We are recording this presentation and we'll be posting all these out to our websites when we're finished. Additionally, if you notice that each of you are muted, so if you have questions, feel free to post them over here in the chat and type those in. And Adam said that, you know, as those come on here, we can see if we can answer those along the way as we can, as we are able to. And so the morning we're doing the session is on developing the mapping of INDOT's 20-year plan, its asset plans. And so INDOT's asset plan team has recently focused on centralizing their long-term asset plans, and that's the title here, the 20-year plans, so that they can be referenced in a variety of formats in tools, either in the office or out in the field. And those tools include ArcGIS Online, field maps, PowerApps, SharePoint, PowerBI, and we use FME also to kind of help blend all this together. So this presentation will likely touch some on the Microsoft tools, but really focus more on the GIS tools, our online, the field apps and FME and those sort of things, and how this is all put together, all the nuts and bolts and such, the functionality there. And just kind of showing how this is used by folks in our Pavement and Bridge asset engineering teams, how they store and share their plans. And today we're joined by Adam Tyra, and Adam's a civil engineer who's been with INDOT since 2015. And since that time, he's served in a variety of roles, asset management and traffic and bridge, pavement, drainage, and currently spending most of his time looking at ways to facilitate and improve the workflows for all the asset management teams throughout the agency. So with that, I'll give the floor over to Adam and let him take it away here.
All right, thank you, Joel. So like Joel mentioned, I'm going to be starting off with a brief PowerPoint introduction just to show sort of how everything sort of fits together. But the goal is that I'll just basically be hopping through a variety of aspects of what we built out. And so if you guys have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat and we can hopefully address them as we get along. So I will go ahead and start sharing my screen. And then let's open up the presentation. Okay, so to begin with, as Joel touched on, so the purpose of the plan. So 20-year plan is a bit of a misnomer at this point. We go out further than 20 years, but in general, that's the term that's stuck. But the goal is that we have a shared long-term vision of what we want to accomplish in the future. So these are obviously not set in stone. They are just a plan. But the goal is that we have a starting point so that various people can refer to them. And as the quote that I really like goes, and I think other people really care for it too, is plan the work and then work the plan. So as you go along, if things need to be adjusted, they can, but you have at least a starting point. So the other nice thing about this is that we take it from a bunch of discrete spreadsheets that people are holding on to. Maybe they're not in the correct format. They don't have good data domains, data integrity, validation, stuff like that associated with them. And we put them all into one place so that it's always the authoritative source. And there's no question of, hey, have you turned this in? Did you change it since the last time? So we have better resources for that. In terms of the assets that we're currently using, so we currently have pavement and bridge, and then we are working towards large culverts next, and then eventually small culverts. I think this methodology for how we share and plan things can generally be expanded to a variety of other assets, including things like traffic signals and stuff like that. And one thing, so the the pavement and bridge plans are fairly robust in terms of what they what the level of detail. But even if it's just an asset where you just want to say, okay, I want to do one thing on this in say 10 years or something like that, it doesn't necessarily have to be a ton of detail for each of these for it to still be useful for us to relate the data. So the other thing that this allows us to do, especially in sort of the different formats that I'll show it to you in today, is that it allows a bunch of other stakeholders that might be interested in what we're doing in the future could be. So in case any of you have never seen it, it's sort of like the life cycle of an asset in terms of scoping the work, figuring out what needs to get done, designing it, constructing it, then maintaining it, and then eventually going back to scoping and so on. So that is the sort of life cycle associated with it. But each of the people along that route might be interested in what we're doing in regards to the plan. So I'm not going to necessarily touch each of these in a lot of detail, but I wanted to sort of show the different portions that we're making use of for this. So to begin with, so we have some outside sources of data. So we've got pathways data, which it collects pictures, imagery, and stuff like that. We have SPMS, which we use to manage contracts. BIAS, which is used for bridge inspection data. And then we have Dayton. Oops, I need to turn on. Do not disturb. Do not disturb. There we go. And so.
So are you sharing your screen yet, Adam? You're just talking to it. Someone is
I apologize. I apologize. I thought I was.
No, so you're not.
Explain why I was not. Okay.
There we go. Thank you so much. Okay.
I must have clicked a button to not share my screen.
You're fine. You're fine. Thank you so much.
Okay. So yeah. So going into this, so we have a few different sources of data, including we've got pathways, SPMS, BIAS, which is for bridge inspection, DTEMS, which is kind of paralleling what we're doing in terms of planning out data in the future. And then all of those sources of data are sort of residing on separate servers, and they're getting compiled in our data warehouse, which is Oracle. And then our data itself is actually getting stored in the SharePoint list, and then we're using FME to manipulate data, and then we're using ArcGIS Online as well as like ArcMap and SDEs for the enterprise servers to manipulate the data. And then we're using PowerApps as an interface, and then PowerBI for analysis. So should we run through that? So again, so as far as authoritative reference sources go, we're pulling this data and we're treating that data that's getting centralized in the data warehouse as authoritative, or at least referring on a regular basis to the authoritative sources. And then we're actually storing the plan data within the SharePoint list. So we've got a variety of lists. And if anybody's curious about that, we can talk later about it. But essentially, we're using a few different lists, one like some for reference and then some as the one that's actually getting edited by the users. But that helps us keep the data sort of in sync across the different platforms. Then in terms of data validation, to make sure that things are correct, and then manipulating it so that it gets into the different formats that we need and stuff like that, we're using PowerApps and then FME. And then in terms of actually seeing and analyzing, like I mentioned, we're using Power BI and web maps. So in terms of GIS components specifically, we're using roads and highways. And then we have our asset inventory, which is in roads and highways along with the 20-year plan maps. And then we have the FME tools. And then if there's interest and we have time, I'll get to what we're doing with driven histories. So to begin with, just a little bit of background. So roads and highways as a linear referencing tool. So linear referencing, this suite of tools. Linear referencing is not specific to Esri, but roads and highways is the primary tool for linear referencing that's offered by Esri. So linear referencing refers to where you have a road network. So let's pretend that this this line here represents a stretch of interstate, and so we can pretend like there's curves and stuff like that in there. And then basically what we can do is we can say, instead of having independent geometry for a given asset, we instead say what the asset's location is relative to the linear referencing system. So essentially what we do is we say, okay, which route is it on? And then where on the route in terms of measures, so from and end, is it? And then there's also a temporal nature to it. I won't get too much into that, but basically, is it active? Is it retired? Stuff like that. And then the other part of this is that if it's not on the linear referencing system, then it can be non-LRS data. But that would be things where it either runs, say, perpendicular to it, adjacent to it, off to the side. It's a point feature that's sitting on the side of the road, or it's a polygon. So one thing that's really useful about linear referencing is that, say you have a change in alignment for the road. So like a radius changes, or like an extra curve is added, something like that. The change to all of the events on there, if you have, say, like 1 or 2 assets that you're tracking on there, it's not as big of a deal. But when you're tracking a bunch of different data that's all snapped to that same geometry, you can change it all with one fell swoop by changing the linear referencing system, and you don't need to worry about how they match up after that. So that's really useful for what we're doing. So in terms of the data, so right now, so we've got our asset inventory that we're using for bridge and pavement. But like I said, we'll probably get into large culverts and small culverts later. And then we also have pavement condition data. So the pavement condition data is collected annually. It takes about another year after that to process it. And then it gets pushed to the into different systems, including things like roads and highways, DTEMs, other places like that. So having that pavement condition information available to us when we're doing the analysis and planning out future projects is critical. In a sort of side note for that, that system is much more automated. It's much more tied into the geometry, whereas the bridge data is more tied to the asset ID, because the asset IDs for bridges are much more discrete, and so they don't necessarily have to live as natively in GIS compared to pavement. So then the other part of this is the data that we're generating for this work specifically. So we have dissolved bridges and pavement keys. So for bridges more so than pavement keys at this point, but the goal is that if they have separate features that define them, we're dissolving those down to just get a single feature for each of these, so that we can get one-to-one in terms of an asset ID to a feature in GIS. And then the other part of it is that in those dissolved features, we're pulling data that is that may not be native to roads and highways, so it's not authoritative. So like that bridge inspection data, we're pulling that in to those dissolved features in some cases. And so then the other portion of it is that we're using time-enabled layers. So in this case, we want to show in a given year where the features are and what years those associate with. So, and then just real quick, just a bit of background also. So you have web maps, which function as kind of the base platform, and then you build web apps on top of those. And then in a lot of cases, what we're using the web apps for are launching pads for lots of people to access their data in lots of different ways, as well as view the data. So a couple of things I want to go into. So in terms of app functionality is direct link to features in the map from outside sources. So using linking based on URL parameters to get there. And then using Arcade, which is a language that Esri uses within ArcGIS Pro and then ArcGIS Online to be able to come up with some stuff, and then some custom pop-ups that you can use. So with that, yeah, so let me go and hop over here. So I want to show off a couple things with regards to this. So going back to the dissolved bridges. So to begin with, this is one scenario where we have a bridge that is natively split in two, and it should be split in two. But just because we have the so the linear referencing system along here. So this is I-74, and then it becomes old US 421, right? So the breaking point for that happens to be right here, but these two bridges are, this is the same bridge, but it's split so that they have different route IDs on here. So to that end, we need to basically be able to dissolve those and come up with a single layer. So then for the pavement keys, so let's hop over here to show off this one. Okay, so custom expressions. So there's a couple different ways in web maps, and I'm showing this in Map Viewer Classic because the new Map Viewer experience doesn't have all of the features yet ported over to it, though it is nice for certain things, but it is not fully featured yet, and we haven't migrated everything over there yet. But one thing I wanted to show off, so you can use Arcade to come up with expressions in a couple different ways. So you can use them for labels, or you can use them for symbology. But in this case, I'm using it for things that show up in pop-ups. So to add an expression, you just click on this, and then it'll give you some boilerplate text, and then you can put that in there, and then you can reference different aspects of it. So in this case, one very simple example, but is very nice, is to be able to clean up text. So our NBIs, which is National Bridge Inventory, so it's basically the unique asset ID that we use for our bridges. In a lot of cases in the SPMS system, it doesn't store the leading zeros. So, but to make it match up with some of the other systems, we need those leading zeros to be in there. So in this case, I'm just using Arcade to just say, okay, if it's empty, don't worry about it, just put an unspecified, but otherwise change it to this format if necessary. So then I test it, in this case, not specified, but if I were to click on one of these, you can see that I'm referring to that specific expression, and it's got the leading zero. So the other thing that you can do that is really powerful is you can refer to geometry for each of the features within within each of the layers. So in this case, what I'm doing is I'm referring to geometry for the SPMS data, so it's linear data. And what I need to do is basically grab those points. And to do that, and I credit a community thread on Esri's site, but basically coming up with, okay, what is the equivalent latitude and longitude, because all of our data is in UTM 16, I believe. And so to that end, we need to convert it to lat and long. And then eventually spit that out into a URL string that Pathways understands. So through this, basically, it's calling these different functions, and it's saying, okay, use the geometry from this, and then pass it through, and then eventually insert those into here, and then ultimately return the URL. So the nice thing about this is that then we can use, nope, not that one. I wanted to do, sorry, I got to go back in time to some time where SPMS data actually exists. Plan. There we go. So Path Web Street View, that's the generated URL in here. And then when I click on that, it takes me here. And then you'll notice that on here, the beginning point of it was on, I think that's 52, just outside of 465. And then, okay. And then you see it plopped me down right here because it was snapping to that location based on the project. So basically I drop right in to where it is, and then I can drive along there as I go. So that's handy for that purpose. You can use that for a variety of things, including going back out to other places like Google Maps and stuff like that. It just so happens that we use video log / PathWeb for a lot of that stuff. So one other thing I wanted to show off in here is the links. So one thing that you can do with this is when you do the links, your URL can either be the expression itself. So in this case, it was the entire expression that I generated down here. But then your other option is that you insert the text for the URL directly in there, and then you cap it off as needed for the project ID. Or some other attribute in here. So in this case, I know that this project has a unique ID that's in our SPMS system, and then I can link back to it directly into the SPMS data, and it'll take me to that project information specifically. So I really like that. I think it's really powerful. So yeah. So hopping around to a couple of things. So looking in here at the 20-year plan. So this is obviously the edit mode for it. I'll hop back over that in a second. So by default, I have time sliders turned on this layer, on this map. So to get the time slider to work, what you need is a layer that is time enabled. So what's critical for that is when the data is published, it as like a REST service or some other way of hosting it, it needs to be denoted as such. You don't necessarily need to use it as time enabled, but that setting has to be turned on, and you need a field that's associated with it. Oftentimes I find that if you are trying to associate it with a specific unit in time, in terms of saying, okay, I want this to go from 21 to whatever we said, like 2060, 2041. In this case, you need to, it works best if you have that unit sort of discretely broken out, as opposed to it being just the date. So in this case, the fiscal years themselves are what I'm interested in. So there's a field in there that's just a numeric value for the year. So I find that generally works the best. If you want to do months, you could probably do that. But in this case, breaking the year out into a separate one works well. So like I showed off here, so the nice thing about this is that if you're interested in a specific window, it will dynamically temporally filter all of this data. So if I were to click on one of these, you can see that this is associated with fiscal year 28, and then it gives data that's for the that specific asset and for the treatment type. So likewise, I've got pavement data down here with its plan as well. So yeah, so the one other thing that I'll say about this is, in the past, when you would look at the time slider widget and you would do the continuous, you would do the settings for it, it would do this odd thing where it would take a, so say you were interested in just seeing a year and you were using the date fields, and your interval was 1 year. What it would do is it would say from, say, January 1st of 2020 to January 1st of 2021. So that's not a year, that's a year plus 1 day, right? And so if you're then trying to display it in terms of years, it would get really messy because the information, depending on how you had it stored, you get some overlaps and stuff like that. It seems like they probably have resolved that within here, but I'd be mindful of that if you're interested in using that. So to look at it then further, one other thing is that if I click on another filter within here, you'll notice that my time slider turned off. So what I would recommend is making sure that your users are aware of that, so that if they do wish to set one of the filters that maybe you have set up here, that then they can just turn the time slider back on after that. So not a big deal, but it's just kind of an odd choice. So hopping around, so looking at this, so in terms of, this is one way to view the data. The other option is that going directly into PowerApps. So this is the primary editing interface for it. And this is what's looking at the data that's residing in SharePoint. So you'll notice that it hopped directly to this specific asset from the map because it's making use of the asset ID from here to get to this point. And then we can click into a specific plan to look at some of the other information for it. If they were just accessing this information directly from PowerApps, if that's where they were starting, they would show up at this screen, and then they would be able to go here and set filters and look at other stuff to sort of filter down their information. But that's how they would do that. But then the nice thing is, I showed you that sort of interweaving web of work and apps and stuff like that, is that we can just click back if they want to see where this is located. This is actually going to a slightly different map than the upcoming projects. This is a map where it's sort of pared down and it's only showing bridges. And there's PKs as references because they need to know usually where those are in reference to it. But this way they can link back to it and zoom directly to that. Now, to get that to work, let me do this one. So to get that to work well, in terms of, you'll notice here, I've got this URL parameter here at the end where it's query, and then the bridge layer, you've got the %20 to take the place of a space for the layer name. But then you've got the attribute field name, and then you've got the field that it's actually looking for to query. So in that there, to set that up, it's fairly easy. All you need to do is using the search widget, which in a lot of web apps is on there by default. It's just this search bar here. If you go in here and you add a search source, so in this case, pavement sections, and then you add a field or fields that you want it to search by, then that becomes available to you to link back to in that case. So in this specific case, we have it enabled for the bridge lines for the NBI attribute, and as long as it can find a valid ID to link to, it will. So yeah, so that is very well. And then this is the Pavement version of it. I wanted to show you this just as a bit of background. The interface for PowerApps, it is very visual based in terms of I have these different things that I'm clicking on, and then you're editing attributes about them. I have found it to be very powerful. As a little bit of background, we started conceptualizing the 20-year plan in sort of this format in sort of middle of 2020. But in terms of building all of this out, in terms of these PowerApps and all the maps associated with them and the FME tools and this, that, and the other thing, this has been about 9 months worth of work. So I like this interface. You can use it for SharePoint. You can use it for Oracle or SQL servers or a variety of other interfaces. The one thing that I will say, if you are interested in using PowerApps as the front end for data sets, especially if you have a very large data set, you will want to look into delegation and know the limitations that might be inherent to filtering down data sets and stuff like that. So I won't bother a bunch of going into more detail, but that is something that's very important. So one other thing is that from here, so we have the 20-year plan, and so this data set is read-only, obviously, because we're injecting it back into roads and highways and then offering it up for this web map to see. The way that we get that in there is we use FME. So so there's Model Builder, which is natively in ArcMap, ArcGIS Pro, and it has some useful stuff for it. And in the past, what I've done is I built some processes in Model Builder, but I find that it's not always as efficient as it could be. And I understand that if I was more proficient in Python, that I could really see some really good efficiencies for that. But given that I am not as proficient in Python, FME is a great alternative for that. So the other part of it is that what might take is like 1, 2, or many more steps depending on what you're trying to do, especially in regards to changing attribute, like basically doing find to replace for certain attributes. I find that you can do that very quickly in FME, and it might be much more cumbersome at Model Builder. And then the other great thing about it is that it can natively consume and export data in a bunch of different formats. So whether it's Excel or an Oracle database or an SDE or file geodatabase or any number of other things, it can take that data in and then you can manipulate it, look at, join it, filter it down, do whatever you want, and then export it to your desired spot without much issue. One thing that I will say about where FME doesn't always perfectly meet our needs is the linear referencing system functionality that's natively available in FME is not very robust. However, there is a group in Arizona called GIS Research, led by Boguo, and they do great work. They're super responsive, and I really like working with them. They have some custom tools that they build within there that we've collaborated on. So I just wanted to give them some respect for that. So I think that they're doing a really good job of filling in some of those gaps, but it's not maybe as robust as some of the tools that are available directly within roads and highways. So the other portion of it is that there are, in some cases, there's issues writing back to an SDE if the data is versioned or if the field has a domain applied to it. So in a lot of cases, what that looks like is the data, it will insert the rest of it and it doesn't necessarily return an error, but it just leaves the field blank. Even if you're passing it what would otherwise be valid data values for it. So one way that we get around this is that we go back to Model Builder and then we extract, basically we export the Python script for that last little step in terms of taking it from like a staging file to GeoDatabase and using the tool where we insert or append event tables onto into the SDE. We grab that code and then we manipulate it and then we add it sort of in line with Task Scheduler. So FME will do the heavy lifting and then the Python script will just push it the last little bit of the way. So I want to show a couple things with FME that I really liked. So coming here. So this data, this what this is doing in this particular workflow is it's taking the raw data from a couple different sources, including pavement sections that are not currently active but are planned in the future, and then pavement sections that that are currently active in the system. And it is going through manipulating them and exporting them to the dissolved pavement sections. A couple things I wanted to show in terms of the Attribute Manager and a couple other tools. So one thing that I really like about how they have FME set up is that if at any stage along the way you would like to sort of further inspect what the data that's coming out of it is, whether it has geometry or not, but you can just click on that port and see what's coming out of it. The other nice thing is that, so in this case, I'm filtering out duplicates, but say for some reason that I wanted both of these to come out and both end up there, you can add multiple sources in very quickly to a given location. So then the other nice thing about this is that you can quickly use this transformer in particular to rename any of the attributes along the way. You can remove them. So if I wanted to remove this, I could either delete it, or the other option in addition to those is I can set values. So one nice thing that is really powerful is you can use conditional values. So basically it's embedding like a test filter directly within this. And so I can say if it meets these conditions, then output this value. And it's something where if it doesn't happen to meet any of those, then you can just leave it alone and let it pass through unchanged. But yeah, this tool is very powerful. And then the last portion of it is, in fact, here, I'll show you this on here. So this is an example of where the district names. So we wanted to rename the districts on here. So you can see if it's got basically uppercase, I can change them to like proper case, or in this case for Fort Wayne, I would add the period. So I can keep them in a consistent format that way. So yeah, so I really like this tool. One thing about this also is that I ran this just before we started, and it took slightly under 2 minutes to run all of these processes. Even for much larger data sets, most of them take like only a few minutes. If I only have like 1 or 2 steps, it can finish in like 1 or 2 seconds. So there's some different ways to even make this even more efficient along the way. But yeah, this is very powerful, and I really like it because it I know some coding, but I'm not super advanced with it. So if anybody has any questions about FME or other things like that, it'd be feel free to reach out to me afterwards. So
just to let us know, Adam, we're down to about 6-7 minutes here.
Yep. So next steps. So as I mentioned earlier, so the next thing that we're going to do is generate other large culvert or other asset plans within sort of the same format. They probably won't be as complicated, but they have their own sort of unique wrinkles to them, including the fact that like large culverts typically are perpendicular to a road, and so sort of assigning their location, stuff like that, is a little bit odd compared to bridges, which are on a road, whether it's above it or carrying it directly. But so each of them sort of has their own unique things. And then after large culverts, like I mentioned, small culverts is next. And then eventually we can probably do some other assets as well. So one other thing that I really want to work on in the not too distant future is determining relationships between assets using FME. So the goal is that we will be able to say, okay, this bridge is on this PK and or it's on a ramp that's adjacent to the PK, or it travels over the PK and provides some information for that. So this would be something that would be running automatically, so it doesn't require our users to maintain something in case like something changes. It would just be something that would be systematically derived in the system. So the great thing about that is you can quickly answer questions that are related to that are reliant on those relationships. And then the other part of that is that you can use it for a variety of different interfaces for it. And then ultimately, I want to expand the suite of reports in Power BI. So I didn't really touch on it here, but Power BI, just like Tableau, is really powerful. One thing I like about it is the interactive nature of it. So if I were to click on this, it automatically filters stuff. I've got that same link out to PathWeb using the latitude and longitude. I can click on this, go back to the map for that specific asset ID, and then it's a little slow, but the great thing about it is sort of the not necessarily circular nature of it, but the interconnected nature of it. So I really like using each of these tools for like a different piece of the puzzle in terms of what the users are most comfortable with. Oh, one very important thing that I did not mention, PowerApps. This is accessible on a tablet. This is basically what the interface looks like on a tablet. And then obviously all of these maps, not the web apps themselves, although if you wanted to pull them up in Chrome, you could. But the web apps, the web maps are available in collector, field maps, stuff like that. So this is available to them in the field as they're driving around if they want to inspect it or they want to change it. This is available to them regardless of their location. Yeah, so that's I believe all that. And then let's see here, one last thing. So next steps. And just on here, I can add some more links to some other stuff, but this is things about Arcade, how to use querying in web apps, and then creating custom pop-ups in Esri. So yeah, I thank you for your time. And then if there's any questions or anything, feel free to let me know.
All right. We got 2 or 3 minutes here, so if anybody has questions, go ahead and feel free to put them in the chat. I think you've explained it so well. There's no questions.
But yeah, like I said, it's still in development. So